Hello and welcome to a naval history long patrol. And if you probably guessed, you might have from the sound behind me, there is not just me here. There is the fluffy research assistant. Although at the moment the date is wrong behind me. Like magic, it has changed. And this is the long patrol that will go alongside. Well, to an extent, it's going to come out sort of after. Well, that thing is coming out after the Patron 32 Japanese heavy cruiser 1920s and 1930s. Were they worth it? And the reason I'm doing a long patrol as well, the one which I did live, is I don't always do it for all the Patreon ones, but I'm doing it for this one because Japanese heavy cruisers are an interesting ideal, an interesting idea. You start off with what are reconnaissance ships by reconnaissance by force. You look at their design, they are fast, well, 35.5 knots for the Furataka. Fairly good range, although not massive for the joys of the Pacific Ocean. But more importantly, they're quite well armed and they're orientated around their guns and their torpedoes. In many ways, they are an archetypal cruiser. I would argue, like with the British heavy cruisers of the time, the Hawkins class, they are far more light cruiser stepped up to something called a heavy cruiser than a paradigm from the armored cruisers, which were the true heavy cruisers. Now, their armored cruisers, of course, have evolved into battle cruisers, which is going to be addressed at the beginning because we're going to be discussing the Ibuki battle cruisers or armored cruisers. But the point is that this means that these aren't, how can I put this politely? They aren't truly heavy cruisers. That is the first thing you have to understand when you start looking at the ships in the 20s and 30s. If you're talking about the Alaska class, if you're talking about the Deutschland class, the Panzerchief, those are actually heavy cruisers, as a heavy cruiser would be if they had developed from the armor cruisers as they should have done. And it's the gap in the treaties. In order to leave no ground for people to have semi-capital ships, and that they grouped, of course, battleships and battle cruisers together to become capital ships in the treaties, they made a huge amount of dead space between the limits and the abilities of them and cruisers. And we can argue all we want that some of the proposals, which would have seen a limit of 18,000 tons for heavy cruisers and a limit of 54,000 tons from memory for battleships and capital ships, would have been sensible, especially as it included that light cruisers would be limited to 9,000 tons. This is one of those ideas which is talked about at the time. I'm never quite sure how official the proposal is, whether this is sort of one of the submissions put together. But those figures seem to crop up in various discussions at points. Although I should mention that John Jordan's authoritative work doesn't mention them, so I would suspect that those figures are very early talking point considerations, which, as I said, I've come across them in the British reference to UK National Archives documents, and I've come across them in reference to French National Archives documents. I haven't heard any mention in American or other ones, so it might well have been something early that was considered as a proposal. And it's a sort of one of those interesting what ifs then at that point. If it did happen, what would we be dealing with? Well, if it did happen, for starters, the Attacker class, the first class of heavy cruiser we're talking about, they displace only 7,100 tons in standard. They would have been light cruisers under those designations. They're under 9,000 tons. And that's something which always really interests me. The fact that it could have been this route not gone, and how it would have affected things. I think it would have had most effect on the Japanese. The British and Americans would have killed burning cruisers, but you have to remember the Japanese, what are they focusing on? The Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. And you cannot deliver the decisive battle without having accurate information, which means the reconnaissance function of your cruisers is absolutely critical. Especially when you rely on them for the aerial reconnaissance, not your carriers. When you make that decision because you want your carriers to have the most strike power possible, then it limits you. Anyway, before we get into everything else, let me just mention two things. One, I want to say hello to B1900 Pilot. Hello. He sent me a lovely message on Patreon back in January, and it showed up this morning. So I have no idea why. I got one message which definitely was sent today, and then a whole load of other messages came through behind it, which were older messages, which I've responded to, and one message which I've been meaning to respond to for ages. So I apologise. Patreon messages. I hadn't. One of them I hadn't got round to. One of them I'm really quick on responding because I literally respond within minutes of being sent, and that message showed up 3 or 4 others came up behind it and just went, oh, well, you haven't been telling me about you at all. What are you doing up? Anyway. Also, why have I got this up? Because, as some of you who are regular viewers will know, I have got a spreadsheet site has been set up, and it's got lots of different things on it. And lots of different designs and more coming. There's more stuff coming to Patreon. Sorry, I have got a poodle who's trying to nick my iron brew as we speak. Not the full bottles, the empty bottle. He decided it's a toy. He's very carefully extracted it from beneath my leg. You happy now? Have I made it no fun because there's no cap? Yes. And when I put the spreadsheet up, I, of course, put a Blackburn design up there, and my aunt has set me a challenge. If I get to 13,000 subscribers by December 31st, 2021, she and my uncle will take a picture of them both wearing Blackburn face masks. And family bragging rights, but let's put it this way, I'm realistic in that I realise I have roughly 6,600 subscribers. But I'm hopeful because I like my 6,600 subscribers, and I'm hoping you'll all invite a friend, and then I'll get to win the family bragging rights. And I hope there's lots of new viewers watching these videos. Anyway. Yeah, let me go. Now, a couple of weeks back on another video, I was asked about the Ibukai battle cruiser or armor cruiser. They start off as armor cruisers, that's what they're built at, but they're built at the same time as HMS Dreadnought. So after she is built, what did the Royal Navy then build? The invincible battle cruisers. And what does everyone then want to say they have? Battle cruisers, because battle cruisers are the new armor cruisers. And by the way, that is battle cruiser spelt as it is spelt up there, not battle cruiser one word. I get into this one on a regular basis. Battle cruiser as one word is newspaper talk that comes about during World War I. When you look at some of the earlier descriptions, it's a battle cruiser, just as there's been an armored cruiser, which wasn't one word. So I go with battle cruiser. And they're not, but for Japan, it's important to call them battle cruisers for two reasons. One, to show they have the latest, greatest, most modern technology, and one of them does have turbine power. One of them is triple expansion engines, but one of them has turbine power. Secondly, there is honestly the fact that they do outclass pretty much every armored cruiser out there. Let's be honest, if von Spey's squadron had come across these two, there wouldn't have been much left of them afterwards. The 12-inch guns are mean, the 8-inch guns will tear them apart. But what is a later factor is, of course, when you're going to treaty, and Japan is trying to make a big thing to try and get qualify as for as much capital ship tonnage as it can. Designating them as battle cruisers helps with that. Because battle cruisers are part of the capital ship tonnage. And remember, Japan ends up with a 7 to the 10-10 split of the US and UK. Which I would argue was a bad deal for the UK and is a very good deal for the US, and an exceptional deal for the Japan when you work it through. Because if you think about it, Japan has to focus on primarily one ocean, the Pacific. America, primarily two oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic. So, arguably, they could make the case for having twice as much as Japan. However, the reason they don't make that case is because when you make the decision, which they did in the treaty, that the British Empire will be treated as one, you run into a problem. Because Britain is, of course, in the Atlantic, has territories in the South Atlantic. The Mediterranean, which isn't an ocean, but very complicated. The Indian Ocean, which is an ocean, and also quite complicated. Oh, and the Pacific. And thanks to the Hong Kong and its other interests, you can technically claim both South and North Pacific. You want to be really North and South Atlantic if you really want to be Atlantic. But basically, there is not a single ocean which Britain can't claim it needs to be in. So if Japan was one, under this agreement, Japan would get the full fleet to fight in one ocean. America would get the allowance to fight in two oceans. And then Britain would get the permission to fight a fleet for fighting in 5 oceans. And there was a very interesting article put out recently which had various statements from Herbert Richmond, who is one of the theorists in the late 1920s, early 1930s. Two things I would like to point out about Richmond. One, he calls himself a theorist. Not really the brightest bushel in the woods. No, read some of his works. He does have some. He does alight on some good things, but it's how do I put this? There are some people who are right all the time, and there are some people who are right none of the time. And the rest of us are on a spectrum in between that. Richmond's on the end of the spectrum towards the none of the time. Gets very obsessed with Sir Walter Raleigh. Not you. Your namesake. Anyway, that's the story of the Ibukai class battle cruiser or armored cruiser. They're armored cruisers, but they are called battle cruisers because that's the new name for what had been the armored cruiser. And yeah. So The Japanese strategy is, of course, the Kantai Kessen. I have been over this in several videos, and it's all about seeking a decisive battle. And as I said in live, I honestly don't think Japan ever actually achieved it, or ever actually really threw itself into a battle in a way to achieve it. They held carriers back before Pearl Harbor. They could have sent more. They could have sent more waves of aircraft. They didn't. They pulled their punch. They pulled their punches in lots of battles because they weren't the decisive battle, and they were always preserving their strength for the decisive battle. Now, here is the problem, and I think it comes down to a very, very simple solution. In fact, actually, someone has already commented with an eye to this on my channel, in that on the live. Who is it? It was Ethan McKinney. Ethan, I do like your analysis, but of things, and I do love the way you stick to the 3-2-2-3 pattern in terms of guns. Sorry, this is off on the comments, but I'll just quickly comment. But his main comment has been that when during these analysis, and I'll be getting into his cruisers, I keep pointing out they could have just gone for four treble turret designs, and his response is metrocentric height, which of course is valid, but they make the decision to build. I'm not suggesting you convert something which has 5 twin turrets to 4 trebles when it's already been built. I'm suggesting that as you're already designing it and breaking the rules, you might as well design it properly and build it with 4 trebles. And then that wouldn't cause any trouble with the metrocentric height, because you probably make a slightly different hull. Because you wouldn't use the same hull for 5 twins that you would for 4 trebles. It'd probably be the same length, but it might be a little bit fatter. Just a tad, which would have an impact on the metrocentric height. And also, where you balance the machinery and various other things would affect the metrocentric height. It's quite easy to deal with at the beginning. So, please note that is my comment going through, for anyone who's wondering this. And again, it goes with the Kantai Kessen. They have designed a strategy which is based around Japan's infrastructure limitations and maritime industry limitations to try and achieve a superiority in war by having a decisive battle which they win, a la Tsushima or Trafalgar, and after that they get to dictate peace. That's their plan. It's the Greek plan, or as Ethan puts it, which is kind of interesting, because I was thinking about Greeks and Carthaginians and those, but he also sort of puts it as the Confederacy strategy. And I can understand him putting it as a Confederacy strategy, but it never really works out that way for the Confederacy. It doesn't work out for anyone, and he puts down to it being quite complicated in the American political structure for them to end wars. I would argue, though, that neither America nor Japan had really understood each other, and Japan certainly hadn't understood Britain, because you have to remember the Kantai Kessen decisive battle strategy was supposed to be fought against Britain and America, because they honestly believed that if they ended up at war with one, they would end up in war with the other. And that's one of the reasons why they take the gamble they do at Pearl Harbor in 1941, because in their mind, Britain is fighting a war against Italy, and their navy's stopping the British being able to use the Mediterranean as a funnel straight through to the Far East, and they're tied down fighting a long-dragging commerce war in the Atlantic versus the Germans. So they will only have that knocks the British out of the fight, so they can focus on the Americans. But if you consider that, even if you win the Kantai Kessen, the decisive battle, you're probably going to take so much losses that if you're then fighting the British fleet, or if you did it on the British fleet, and then you find yourself fighting the American fleet, which, by the way, are 2 very different fleets in terms of their modus operandi and their way of operating. So actually, your doctrine may work well against one, but don't necessarily work well against the other, or vice versa. It's a rather interesting analysis to get into, and that could be a whole different other video. Speaking of which, patron votes and patron suggestions are live at the moment. But you're probably going to be sufficiently battered up that you're going to be ripped apart by the other one. In a way, the Kantai Kessen is a sort of reverse of the Risk Fleet, because the whole German Risk Fleet strategy was that they would have a fleet which is so powerful enough that if the British had to fight them, they would lose so much of their so many ships and so much of their naval firepower that they'd be ripped apart by the Americans, the Russians, and the French, who couldn't resist such a confluence of events which would see their primary opponent, the number one power, weakened so that would therefore mean is that Britain would never fight Germany for fear of that happening. Japan's one is to fight a massive battle, win it decisively, but even as such a decisive battle, you're going to suffer a lot of damage to your own forces. You can't fail it. You're going to lose a lot of resources. You're going to lose a lot of pilots. You're going to have a lot of things damaged and hurt. And then no one else is going to interfere. But yet they think that they're going to fight both. Japanese geostrategy is interesting. American geostrategy is just as interesting, but Japanese geostrategy is really quite interesting. Sorry, squirrel outside. The point is, though, about the Japanese decisive battle and their strategy really boils down to they never actually implement it. The Philippine Sea is one which I've studied and I've talked about done in a video, and there are other options. Coral Sea far more than Midway, because Midway, strange enough, they are not expecting there to be American response. You sit there and go, this is a perfect example of where there could have been. And if you'd had any form of counterintelligence system that was coherently functioning, or any sort of how do I put this, detailed staff work looking into that and gone actually acknowledged they do detailed staff work, but the fact that something happens which they don't expect to happen crops up, they kick out of the rules. If they'd looked at that as a reality and gone, that's interesting. If that happens, we could destroy a portion of a critical portion of the American fleet. How would we do that? They could have potentially won Midway. After all, even if they hadn't realized, if they just planned for the contingency, the logical contingency that the Americans might do something they don't consider likely, they would have been prepared for it. And then when the Americans sprung their trap, they would have sprung their own trap. And the Americans wouldn't have been prepared for that. Yes, it would probably required more fuel. But a little bit more fuel spent then could have secured them a lot longer in terms of in terms of being able to get their war effort going. They could have focused ships on other missions other than shoring up various positions after Midway. So where do cruisers fit in this doctrine? Well, they have 3 roles. They are reconnaissance assets, which is critical in the Kantai Kessen battle plan. Information, intelligence gathering, reconnaissance is critical. Screening assets, i.e., preventing the other side, seeing what you are doing. Preventing the other side, seeing what you are doing. It's a old system, but it's a goodie. And supporting the battle line. Now, the last one is sometimes particularly interesting. Supporting the battle line can be, well, It can mean one of two things, depending on who you're talking to. It can be providing extra guns firing at enemy battleships to try and offset their numerical advantage in capital ships, which both, of course, thanks to the treaties, the British and the Americans enjoyed. Or it can mean providing long-range torpedo attacks or preventing enemy destroyers and enemy cruisers from interfering with your own battle line to allow them to concentrate their fire on the enemy capital ships. So those are the two sort of roles encapsulated in that role. Or rather, those are the two sort of duties encapsulated in that role. So here is the Furataka class. Gorgeous looking ships, even when they are rebuilt. And here's the thing, they are rebuilt from having 6 single 7.9-inch guns to 3 twin 8-inch guns. 2 turrets forward, 1 turret aft. They are, in that way, analogous with the York class, in that they're 6 8-inch guns. They go basically they convert a Hawkins to a York. There are a few Royal Navy admirals who probably are spinning in their graves for not having had that idea themselves. After all, they could have got away with that. And the Hawkins class are, let's see. Well, the Hawkins class displaced 10,200, 10,020 tons in standard. So you're starting from something which is a lot bigger to begin with. A beam of 65 feet, 19.8 meters, versus this one's beam of 16.5 meters. So, yeah. Honestly, Royal Navy of the 1920s and 30s, why are we not paying more attention to Japan's modernization of their cruisers? This is what you could have done with the Hawkins class. Admittedly, it is a complete rebuild, but you could have done it. Maybe, if the governments are giving you the money and the time. If they're giving you the money and the time. And I just want to, for comparison, Hawkins class. Royal Navy. You start off with something which looks like this. You could, if you'd applied yourself like the Japanese, ended up with something which looked like this. And it's quite decent, let's be honest. That's quite well armed for the screening role, which is what they were primarily used for. That is a decent equipment. That is a decent system. And for supporting the battle line, has 2 quad 24-inch torpedo tube launchers. Oh, that's fairly decent as well. Reconnaissance-wise, 2 seaplanes operating from a single catapult. Nothing revelatory, but again, not something which is going to be unuseful. And You can see that from the fact of where these ships are lost. They are lost in October 1942, they're lost in August 1942, they're lost at the Battle of Cape Esperance and the Battle of Savo Island. These ships are being usefully used. They might be 20 years old in terms of from when they were laid down by the time they get sunk. But they've had 16 years since they were commissioned, and they have been usefully used. And look how much they've even upgraded in 16 years. If you want a good example of how ships, once they're built, can be completely evolved, this is a great example of it. Look at the funnel shapes. Next comes the Obi class. Now, the Obi class, well, they are the successors to the Furutaka, and there are two of them built. And first things first, we should ask ourselves, how accurate is the American assessment of them? They reckon 7,100 tons in standard. They reckon 8,900 tons roughly full load. Now, well, no, 7,500 tons full load. They're actually 8,900 tons full load. And what's more is, again, they are upgraded. They start off like the Hawkins class, and like the Furutakas with 7.9-inch guns, or, they start off in that world. They get evolved. They are bigger to begin with. Now, I have slightly different figures for them. And I have to admit, my different figures come from the books I've been going through on this. So, those have been the basis of the research, and those are where the figures I've got. So, I think the displacement is for after their conversion upgrade. They become roughly 8,300 tons in standard, 9,000 tons in their full load. They start off as roughly 7,100 tons when they're first built. And I think the thing is, the Americans get the official stats. And again, this is very much the official. At a certain point, they start to give you estimates as well as officials. Next comes the Myoka class. Now, Iobes are in many ways repeats of the Furutakas. The Myoka class, which includes the lovely Ashigara. These are the ships three of which was face down HMS Birmingham, or rather were faced down by HMS Birmingham at Tsingtao in January 1939, and also were involved tangentially in some events which led up to HMS Liverpool's Asamamaru incident of January 1940. Basically, January was not a good year to be in the Far East between the Royal Navy and the Japanese. That usually started off the year pointing guns at each other. Now, the Myoka class, they are different. They are 11,500 tons standard load. This is the point at which the Japanese really start breaking with the treaties. And they break with the treaties in 1924. That's when these are laid down. So they're launched in 1927. They're commissioned 1929. We often try and associate the breaking of the treaties by the Japanese Navy with the fleet faction rather than the treaty faction. And that's a mistake. And I would say that's a mistake for two reasons. One, you have to remember the treaty faction and the fleet faction, neither of them wants war with America. Both of them think war with America is bad for Japan. What they want is to try and deter conflict with America and deter conflict with Britain. They want to be as they have different approaches of how to do it, though. One thinks the best method is to stay within the treaties. The other faction thinks that it's better to go outside the treaties and build up the fleet. Both agree on the needing to build up the fleet part, though. And this means that one faction tries to work within the treaties, but still builds up the fleet. And the other faction is... You can, in a way, say that one faction is actually slightly more honourable, because they want to be open and honest about the fact they're not doing the treaty stuff. And the other one is basically going, we'll use the treaties as cover, and work within the limitations of the treaties, but expand those limitations as much as we can. So we can't build more hulls than we necessarily are allowed, but we can build each individual hull as powerful as we can. And these ships visit Britain, they visit America, they go all around the world. The Royal Navy gets close to their cruisers, Japanese cruisers, as often as it can, and likes to take photos of them next to British cruisers to try and estimate their weights. And one of these goes to the 1937 Fleet Review at Spithead. So the Allied navies know exactly. They don't know by how much, but they do know the Japanese are cheating. But the thing is, they're prepared to tolerate it. Everyone's prepared to tolerate it because everyone's cheating. That's the dirty little secret of the Washington naval treaties. Everyone's cheating. And to be honest, this is going to sound probably upset some people, especially some of my international relations colleagues. But I will let you in on a little secret. Nations always cheat at treaties. They always do. There are always areas they fudge. There are always areas they go, well, we signed up to that, but that doesn't actually really work for us. So we're going to, in practice, ignore it. And as long as we don't make a big noise about it, then everyone else will ignore it, because they're probably going to have bits themselves which they're going to not want to make a noise about. That's the reality of international relations. People being completely two-faced on occasion. South China Sea. Now, you can say there's no real equivalency in the South China Sea between China building whole new islands on territories which don't belong to them according to the International Court of, the Sea and all those things, or you can then point to Diego Garcia and go, hang on, isn't that Britain and America occupying territory which technically should belong to Mauritius according to the United Nations? The thing is, Britain and America turn around and go, well, no, if you look at history and precedent, this is part of the British Indian Ocean territories, and da-da-da-da-da. Because that serves them, because they want Diego Garcia. And honestly, whilst there are lots of countries which are happy to make a noise about it, none of them are going to do anything about it, because it actually serves their interests better for America and Britain to have the base in Diego Garcia and to have the gripe. South China Sea, classic example again. And it serves the same with Japanese building up their ships. Because every time the British or the Americans get into funding issues with their navies, they just turn around to their governments and go, but you realise the Japanese are cheating. and don't admit how they themselves are cheating, i.e., the British by writing whole sections into the treaties which allow them to legally cheat. A la British style. Rolls-Royce diplomacy unit. Always Rolls-Royce. Or the Americans. Saratoga, Lexington. Yeah. The French. We're not gonna go there. There are so many. The Italians, the Germans. Everyone was cheating on their treaties. So, no. Is it a big deal? It is a big deal when you're fighting a war against them. Is it a big deal as long as they're part of the treaties? Not actually. This is the problem for the Japanese once they leave the treaties. When they're part of the treaties, everyone has to seem to be behaving alongside the treaties. The moment they leave the treaty, they actually give an excuse for the escalator clause to activate. And that's the problem ultimately for the Japanese. So ultimately, the treaty faction was probably right, but that means they could have ended up doing Pearl Harbor while still technically being signed to the treaties. That would have been an interesting sign. Anyway, here is another one, the Takeo class. Now, they are supposed to be 9,550 tons in standard. So, how many people think that they are 9,850 tons in standard? Sorry, I think I read that out wrong a bit earlier. You'd be quite right in thinking they weren't. They were 11,530 tons. So, about 1,700 tons different. They are quite cute looking. Now, they have this lovely 10 8-inch gun design, and this is actually what started off the discussions earlier, and the point I was mentioning earlier about the design. Because my point is, if you're cheating and already building something which is going to be 11,500 tons, you could cheat completely and say, well, we're basically building it with virtually no armor, but we're building it with four treble turrets because we think the best armor is to sink the enemy first. And then you don't end up with a gun which can't fire forward, but you have it forward and can only be used for broadside. Now, normally, this gun position would be somewhere in the center here, and I'd still be complaining about it because honestly, I do not like carrying guns which are pointless. But to be honest, I would have less objection to it being sitting in the middle. Because that would mean, okay, if I lose those two guns, I've still got this one and this one. These two. So I've still got 60% of my firepower. And yes, I haven't got anything forward, but... However, if I get these guns taken out, I lose 60% of my firepower. One of them can never fire forward anyway. In fact, it almost has a more restricted angle for firing forward than this turret. Almost. Not quite, but almost. And... what's this? It's just... no. And there are going to be people turning around and go, but that's what Nelson and Rodney have on their front. And if you've watched those videos, you will know I disagree with Nelson and Rodney. I would actually support this more if they had this gun raised up and they'd gone A, B, C. That is, I would have supported that more because then what you could get is B could fire over A and still fire forward. So you could have all 6 guns firing forward, which would be quite useful. You'd be able to provide 60% of your firepower while presenting your most narrow profile. Or as I said, you could just go, if you really want as many guns as you can, just go for 4 trebles. Yes, you'd have to redesign the hull line, but you're already building 11,500-ton ship. You're already cheating by 1,500 tons and actually claiming it's much less. So you're cheating, but you're claiming you're building it 1,700, 1,700 tons less than you're building. You might as well go to full hog. Do it properly. They get upgraded as time goes on. They tend to carry 2 aircraft and 2 catapults. So again, they're part of the screening side. They're reconnaissance by firepower. They're fighting assets. They aren't primarily reconnaissance assets. But the thing is, the Kantai Kessen doctrine is starting to spread up here. And now someone's seen this idea and thought, oh, what can we do with this? So now comes along the Megami class, and I actually like them. I like them a lot. However, I would point out that the Americans included an official 8,500 tons estimate displacement and an estimated of 14,000 tons. And remember, the Megamis originally start life with 5 triple 6-inch guns. Which could have almost been more useful for their role because they are reconnaissance assets. That's what they have actually free seaplanes, they have all these things, but they convert them back to having convert them to having 8-inch guns. And they have a very strange hunchback funnel arrangement, which okay. You will rarely get me say other ships cry out for this because there is both Pom, which likes the Queen Anne houses, but also thinks that the Queen Anne's houses, i.e. the mansion structure that the British build on some of their cruisers and their battleships, is a bit too boxy. But if ever a ship seems to be crying out for a mansion to be built on it, one of those lovely Queen Anne mansions to be built on it, it's the Megami class. You could have done so much with these ships. You really could have. And again, if I had been in charge of the Japanese and I'd been thinking, I want a reconnaissance cruiser, then actually building that kind of structure, making sure that there was a hangar either side of the funnels, maybe putting it so that there's Crown Colony level 6-inch guns or York level 8-inch guns on there. Take off A and take off X turrets. Maybe leave A there. You could do it again. All 3 guns can fire forward. You need Y keeps your stern clear, but you could have then converted the entire backspace, put in a 3rd catapult, and had a really good reconnaissance asset. But this is the thing: the Japanese keep holding their punches when they're doing designs, and these ships are not quick builds. They're not something which is lightly considered. They are built in 1931, order 1933, and 1934. They take a time to order them and get them built. There's also the fact that the Japanese, for these initially, and this is one of the things which is most strange, they have a 152mm weapon system, but they decide they're going to build a 155mm weapon system for them, and then they replace that with the 8-inch. Which they knew they were going to do from the beginning. So efficiency of resources not in Japan's lexicon, obviously. The other really quite interesting thing would be what you'd sort of say if they'd decided to do a mixed 6 and 8-inch gun layout. That could have wound up the American something, but no, they didn't. The class, some of them had 8 Campon boilers, some of them had 10. These are small tube boiler types. But as they're getting more efficient, they need less to get the same roughly the same horsepower. And all 4 of the class have roughly 152,000 shaft horsepower, which gives them a relatively quick speed of 37 knots or 8,000 nautical miles at 14 knots. They are very useful vessels. And they carry 3 seaplanes. Then after them come the Tone class. Now, the Tones, they are pretty much the last class which is properly completed for the Japan. And what you can say is the Japanese ships have been coming increasingly, as you saw the Megami's design. Look how much of it is dominated by aviation facilities. We go back to the Taco again. Aviation facilities dominate its design, and you can see that when you go here. To extent on the Miyako class, aviation facilities have started to dominate. They have very good aviation facilities. These will be built to have 6 float planes, 2 catapults, and pretty much they work by a system of having 4 twin turrets. And this is the point at which I think the Japanese get really quite strange, in my mind, because this pictured one vessel is the second vessel of the Tone class, a Shikuma, which is a lovely vessel. This is Tone herself. And as you can see, if you look, you will notice that it is aviation at the rear, and all the front, all the guns. Interesting enough, if C cants its barrels out of the way in far enough, D can actually fire over B. Just. Not great, but just. So you've got those 6 guns firing forward. But if you notice something, I haven't been going on about screening and supporting the battle line much, despite that being one of their theoretical roles. And yes, they carry torpedoes, and yes, they have 8-inch guns. But this is a ship which has got a huge aviation park on its back. No real hangar for them. No hangar at all. And it's a reconnaissance asset. And if you lose it in its sister, you have nothing to replace it. And that's what leads us to the last heavy cruiser design. And the last heavy cruiser design is the Ibukai. The Ibuki. Again, named for those wonderful armoured cruisers that became battle cruisers. But you might be looking and going, Dr. Clarke, you're a naval aviation historian. That's what your PhD's in. Surely you realise that what you're talking about next to you is an aircraft carrier. Well, here is the dirty little secret. Their search for reconnaissance aircraft and reconnaissance facilities meant that these cruisers developed such extensive aviation facilities that they were, in the case of Ibuki, sorry, someone has tried to teach me to pronounce his name properly, and I'm trying to make sure I do so. They go to whole hog. They now desperately short of aircraft carriers. This ship already has all the facilities for supporting quite a significant air group in mind. They were looking at up to 12 seaplanes, some reports state. And so she gets built. She never gets used as an aircraft carrier. She's laid down in 1942. She's launched in 1943, and they start a conversion in December 1943, and she's scrapped in 1946. So she's never actually properly completed. But here is the thing. She's supposed to be an improvement of the Megami class, which, as we all know, are the heavy cruisers which were officially designed as light cruisers, which ordered in 31. Well, ordered in actually 1930, 1929, but laid down in 31. Completed by 1935. Tornado class, laid down 1934, 1935. Ibuki was laid down in 1942. And this is the problem in the end with the Japanese heavy cruiser program and the Japanese policy for war in World War II. They didn't have the naval infrastructure. They didn't have the maritime infrastructure for a war. They just didn't. And this is going to put the Long into long patrol because it's going to go to about 70 minutes. But the point is, Japan doesn't. They try to build the best ships they can, but they are trying to build a fleet around the deterrents because they're not putting the money into infrastructure, which they could have done. If they put the money into infrastructure, they could have built more cruisers. They could have, come 1937, when they are withdrawn from the treaties, they've got 4 years at that point. They normally seem to have been able to lay down 2 cruisers a year, 2 heavy cruisers a year. Takes them roughly 2 years to build them. So they could have, in that time, presumably, completed 8 more heavy cruisers. They could have also used those slips and built 8, 12, 15,000 ton carriers. Fast reconnaissance carriers, which might have been actually more sensible. And this is ultimately the issue for Japan. Seaplane carriers aren't good for reconnaissance. They really aren't. Why? Because you have to stop and recover the aircraft. You can catapult them off, but you either stop and recover the aircraft, or the crew ditch, get out into a dinghy, get picked up as the ship goes by. Hopefully a ship goes by, and you lose the aircraft. Japan does not have the infrastructure to lose the aircraft. If any nation needed to have a program for producing small, fast carriers for escort duties or for reconnaissance duties, if you don't want to use your primary carriers for it, it's Japan. Considering they are prepared to go to the level of building an entire class of cruisers they classify as light cruisers when they design them to be heavy cruisers, they are lying so shamelessly in every other scenario that there is Article 8 of the treaties which allows you to get away with all sorts of sins in the name of producing any vessel up to 2,000 tons, which theoretically has a top speed of 20 knots. And designed for top speed. Remember, that's the phrase, designed for top speed. The sheer inadequacy of their cheating is what disturbs me. Not that they cheated. As I said earlier, everybody cheats. They do. And you expect it. You build actually in. This is one of the things that's built into the treaty systems. Whenever you can look at them, they actually build in an expectation of everyone cheating into the treaties. There is this whole prima facie stuff done in diplomacy about good faith treaties and good faith intentions. Yes, but then you build in an expectation that actually people could act in bad faith. You build it in. Why do you think there's an escalator? Why else is there an escalator clause in the treaty? Why else do you build these things in? Because of bad faith actors. And because everyone cheats. They shouldn't. But if you have treaties which are set to arbitrary figures, and you have nations trying to build, well, in America's case, a 2-ocean navy, in Japan's case, a single ocean navy, and in Britain's case, a 5-ocean navy, and theoretically you're trying to judge them all to the same standards, you're going to have a problem. Because they can't. So you expect some flex. That's one of the reasons why you have standard displacement coming as a figure. So were the Japanese heavy cruisers of the 1920s and 30s worth it? Yes, because they were essential to Japan's war effort. Let's be honest, they do a lot more than the Kantai Kessen. They do so many battles and so many operations they are critical assets in. Far beyond their roles which they're envisaged for. But here is the other question. Were the Japanese heavy cruisers ruined by the obsession with the Kantai Kessen? Yeah. Yes, they were. Because if you've not got that reconnaissance role on your carrier, you're not going to use your capital ships for it. So it's going to be your cruisers. And if the intelligence role is that important, then your cruisers become dominated by their most dangerous components, their aviation facilities. If you look at how the British treated the aviation facilities and the Americans treated the aviation facilities on their ships, the British stuck them in pretty much separate, self-contained boxes that had everything barring explosive systems to detach them from the ship. The Americans stick them at the end of their ship as far away from everything as they physically can get them. It's almost, I'm not saying they're treating them like they have, they're a sort of 1920s approach to leprosy, but they are, as far as they can put, kept far away from where they can cause an issue. But because of the central importance of reconnaissance to the role of the Japanese cruisers, they have to be built around them. This is arguably why you end up with some of these random gun arrangements. And again, that's the point. The reconnaissance role, the aircraft operation, having to scoot ahead to try and get the pick up the aircraft and get aircraft back means you want to go for as narrow a hull as possible to get as high a speed as possible. Which means you go for the double guns. And that said, if you want to have maximum 8-inch guns, you should have gone for 4 treble mounts. And it could have been really interesting because for the Magamis, that might have meant that if they were building them for treble mounts, they'd have put them in a quadruple mount. And that could have had a really interesting spin-off in history because the British, instead of just designing but deciding it was too complicated and then skipping past it for the Edinburghs, could well have gone down the quadrupled 6-inch turret mount route themselves. in which case we might have well ended up with crown colonies with 12 in with quadruple turrets. We might have ended up with all sorts of vessels with quadruple turrets, which could have had an interesting effect on British design in World War II and several of the actions that took place. Also, it would have meant Belfast and Edinburgh probably ended up with quadruple turrets, because they were ships originally going to be being designed for them. But why did the Japanese focus on reconnaissance so much? Because the Kantai Kessen, the entire doctrine relies on intelligence. Think about it as a strategy. It starts off with you monitoring the approach of the enemy battle fleet to your area. That requires intelligence and reconnaissance. Then you have to direct spoiling attacks to wear them down. Submarines, aircraft, torpedo boats, destroyers, anything you can get small light forces to wear them down. Juno style, but on an oceanic level. Although, I wouldn't really put it down as Juno school. If you look at some of the Japanese doctrines from their own martial history, that sort of idea of wearing their opponent down has been around there for a long, long time. And then the decisive battle. First, a massive carrier strike, well aimed to take out the enemy carriers in one punch. And then follow-up strikes aimed at enemy capital ships and enemy cruisers to weaken those forces before finally the battle fleet thunders into view and wipes them out. With a tremendous crescendo of thundering guns. Every single one of those stages. Japan had learned lessons of Jutland and Toshima. Timing mattered, and that means you need reconnaissance. The trouble is, for Japan, it's the heavy cruisers that have to do it. And in the end, that need for intelligence is so great, it overrides every other function of their design. So what have we got coming up? Well, what long patrols do we have coming up? Well, this is coming out on Sunday, the 26th. This is a long patrol. But answers to various questions put on in the comments of videos are going to be the long patrols coming up for probably the first couple of weeks of October, because I have, and for probably the 28th, as I put there, is the comment response, Chiefs of Staff Axis Navies. Probably going to do Chiefs of Staff Axis Navy. Might switch it around with the other option, which is ship design, and do Chief Staff of Axis Navy's responses as the YouTube shorts. I want to experiment and see how it goes. But yeah, both are coming. We also have on 26th, that's later today, amphibious ship development from the 1980s to modern day, which I'm rather looking forward to doing. And on the 30th, we have interwar naval aircraft development, especially what could have been. And then on 2nd of October, we have a special. We have HMS Dreadnought Day, which is the Saturday, which is going to probably have 3 lives scheduled for it during the day. One evening one, which is going to be a long countdown and going through the history of dreadnoughts, and that's going to be a long one. And dreadnought battleships right from the beginning in probably 1900 starting off, and then going right the way through to about 1960-ish. But the point here, it's going to use, I have to admit, I am cheating for that one in that I'm using some of my slides from my previous Dreadnought series. But that's because I'm repairing 2 others. One of those is going to be on Dreadnoughts which could have been, which I'm hoping to have a special guest for. And and the other one is going to be the countdown, which is going to be launched soon, probably this week, building up to it, of favourite dreadnoughts. Top 10. That's if I can get Survey Monkey to actually work. Wish me luck on that one. And we have the Battle of Kentish Knock on the 8th, which is going to be a Friday. So, you know, there won't be a live on the Thursday that week. It will be a live on the Friday. Also because you're probably going to see some videos from the 7th coming out on the 7th of hopefully me and Drac in Portsmouth doing some recording. Yes, we're going to the historic dockyard. Hopefully, everything is being finally confirmed, and we will be down there. So that should be fun. Knowing him and me, we will turn it into a day of, we're at the dockyard. We will go to around the dockyard. Ooh, there is the Cadbury's factory shop. Not that far away from here. We both have cars. Or one of us will at least have a car. Chocolate? Chocolate. All these things matter. Anyway, enjoy. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed the videos. And finally, before you go, just another reminder about the competition going with my aunt. As I said, she has bet me that I won't get 13,000 subscribers by December the 31st, 2021, and currently I am at 6,670. So, only 6,330 to go. Please help. Pretty please. It's on familial bragging rights. It matters. Thank you. Take care.